The leather cord tightened around Colonel William Barrett's throat at 11:47 p.m. on August 15, 1852. His own polished bootlace became the instrument of his destruction, wielded by hands that had served his breakfast just hours before. This is the story of how one enslaved girl's desperate act of self-defense became a lightning rod for a nation already splitting apart at its moral seams. The Barrett plantation stretched across 300 acres of Missouri bottomland, where the Mississippi River carved lazy curves through soil dark as coffee grounds. Steam rose from the fields in the pre-dawn hours, carrying the scent of turned earth and something else, the metallic tang of fear that clung to places where human beings were bought and sold like livestock. Rosa had awakened to these smells every morning for 17 years, her bare feet finding the familiar grooves worn into the cabin floor by countless others who had risen before the sun to tend another man's land. She was property. The ledger in Barrett's study listed her between a plow horse named Thunder and a milk cow worth $32. Rosa's value, $150, noted in the colonel's careful script beside the date of her birth. But numbers in ledgers couldn't capture what Barrett had stolen from her since childhood. Pieces of dignity torn away like fabric, each violation carefully hidden behind the plantation's facade of Christian respectability. The colonel's wife, Margaret, spent her days in the parlor, practicing piano and writing letters to her sister in Charleston. She knew, of course. They all knew. But Southern society had built elaborate mechanisms for looking away, for pretending that the screams from the slave quarters were just the wind through Spanish moss. Barrett kept Rosa close to the house, claiming she had nimble fingers for delicate work. The other enslaved people understood what this meant. Sarah, the cook, would press extra biscuits into Rosa's palm without speaking. Old Moses, who tended the horses, would nod gravely when their paths crossed in the yard. They couldn't protect her, but they could witness. In a world designed to erase her humanity, their silent acknowledgement became a form of resistance. August 15th had been a scorching day, the kind where even the cicadas fell silent under the crushing heat. Barrett had entertained guests from Jefferson City, politicians and businessmen who spoke loudly about states' rights, while their servants refilled their glasses with imported whiskey. Rosa had served dinner, moving like a shadow between the dining room and kitchen, her eyes fixed on the ground as trained voices debated the price of human flesh. But shadows have substance, and sometimes they fight back. The guests departed around 10 p.m., their carriages disappearing into the humid darkness. Margaret Barrett retired to her chambers with a headache, leaving strict instructions not to be disturbed. The colonel lingered in his study, reviewing contracts for a slave auction scheduled the following week. Rosa's name appeared on the manifest. Barrett had decided to sell her to a cotton planter in Mississippi. She was cleaning the crystal decanters when Barrett summoned her. His voice carried the particular tone she had learned to fear, honeyed words wrapped around threats. The study door closed behind her with a soft click that might as well have been the sound of a trap snapping shut. What happened next lasted less than 3 minutes, but those minutes contained 17 years of accumulated rage. Rosa had endured Barrett's violations since she was barely old enough to understand what was being taken from her. Tonight, when he reached for her with hands that reeked of whiskey and entitlement, something fundamental shifted in her chest. His bootlaces were silk-wrapped leather, imported from Philadelphia and dyed deep brown. Barrett took pride in such details. The mark of a gentleman, he would say. He never imagined those same laces would become his undoing. Rosa moved with the desperate precision of a cornered animal. Barrett, soft from years of comfortable living, couldn't match the strength of someone fighting for her very existence. The leather cord bit deep into his flesh, cutting off the words he might have used to summon help. His struggles grew weaker. His face turned the color of ripe plums. And then William Barrett, who had owned human beings like livestock, became very still. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight as Rosa stared at the body of her tormentor. But what drives a 17-year-old girl To drag a dead man across 300 acres of Missouri farmland in the dead of night? What calculations run through the mind of someone who has just crossed a line that, in 1852 America, meant certain death? Rosa's real story was just beginning, because killing Barrett was only the first impossible thing she would have to do to survive. Before we dig deeper into Rosa's desperate flight, I want to know, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. And if this story has already grabbed you, hit that like button and subscribe, because Rosa's tale gets even more incredible from here. Rosa's shovel struck something hard in the pre-dawn darkness. A root, a rock, or perhaps the bones of someone who had tried this same desperate gamble years before. The sound echoed across Barrett's cotton fields like a gunshot in the Missouri silence. Every minute she spent digging Barrett's grave was another minute closer to discovery, another step toward the gallows that awaited enslaved people who killed their masters. The August night air hung thick as molasses around Rosa's shoulders as she dragged Barrett's body toward the northeast corner of the plantation. Here, beyond the cultivated fields, lay a patch of ground the other enslaved people whispered about in hushed tones. They called it the Forgotten Acre, land too marshy for crops, too isolated for the master's attention. Old-timers spoke of others buried here, runaways who died in the swamps, newborns who never drew breath, bodies that needed to disappear without questions. Rosa had chosen this spot with the calculated precision of someone who understood that survival meant thinking like prey. Barrett weighed nearly 200 pounds, dead weight that left furrows in the soft earth as she pulled him across the fields. Her hands, already torn from years of cotton picking, split open against the rough fabric of his coat. Blood mixed with Missouri clay beneath her fingernails, a communion of violence she would carry for the rest of her life. The digging took 3 hours. Rosa's muscles screamed with each thrust of the shovel, but she couldn't stop. Dawn meant field hands returning to work, meant Margaret Barrett discovering her husband's empty bed, meant the beginning of a manhunt that would end only with Rosa's death. The hole grew deeper, inch by brutal inch, until it could swallow the man who had owned her body but never broken her spirit. She rolled Barrett into his grave without ceremony or prayer. The earth accepted him with a soft thud that sounded like justice. But Rosa understood something that would save her life in the coming months. The best lies are built on fragments of truth. She scattered Barrett's clothes across the fields, tore his shirt to suggest wild animals, left his boots near the creek, where flash floods often claimed the unwary. When the search began, it would follow these false trails into the wilderness, away from the Forgotten Acre, where his bones would slowly dissolve into Missouri soil. The eastern horizon showed the first blush of sunrise as Rosa returned to the slave quarters. She moved through the familiar routine of washing and dressing, her hands steady despite what they had accomplished. Sarah, the cook, studied Rosa's face with knowing eyes but asked no questions. In the peculiar mathematics of slavery, some knowledge was too dangerous to acknowledge. Margaret Barrett's scream pierced the morning air at 6:43 a.m. The mistress had discovered her husband's empty bed, his study in disarray, his favorite decanter smashed on the Persian rug. The plantation exploded into activity, overseers shouting orders, dogs barking, field hands abandoning their work to join the search. Rosa stood among the other house servants as Margaret Barrett wept hysterically into her lace handkerchief. The woman's grief seemed genuine, but grief in 1852 Missouri carried different weights depending on who was mourning. Margaret would inherit the plantation, the slaves, the social position, everything, except the husband who had made her comfortable life possible through violence. Sheriff Thomas Whitman arrived by mid-morning, his horse lathered from the hard ride from Street Louis. Whitman was a practical man who understood that missing plantation owners meant political complications. He questioned the servants with the perfunctory attention of someone going through motions, his eyes already dismissing their testimony before they spoke. Rosa answered his questions with the carefully modulated deference that had kept her alive for 17 years. Yes, she had served dinner the previous evening. No, she had noticed nothing unusual about the colonel's behavior. Her voice never wavered, never betrayed the memory of leather cord tightening around Barrett's throat. The search party found Barrett's torn clothing near Willow Creek, just as Rosa had planned. They found his boots, his pocket watch, even a few drops of animal blood she had carefully placed on a fallen log. Sheriff Whitman declared it a wilderness accident. Barrett had likely been attacked by wild hogs while walking off his evening whiskey, his body dragged into the swamp and devoured. But Rosa knew the real danger hadn't passed. It had only changed shape. That evening, as the household settled into an uneasy routine of mourning, Rosa made her second impossible decision. She couldn't stay. Barrett's death would bring scrutiny, questions, new management of the plantation. Someone would eventually wonder about the quiet house servant who never quite met their eyes, who moved through the world like she was carrying secrets. She began stealing. Small items at first, a few coins from Margaret's purse, bread from the kitchen, a worn dress from the laundry. Each theft was calculated risk, balanced against the larger gamble of escape. The Underground Railroad operated through Missouri, but Rosa had no way to contact its agents safely. She would have to disappear into the vast anonymity of Street Louis and hope her years of watching, listening, and surviving had taught her enough about the world beyond the plantation. The question that haunted her final nights in the slave quarters wasn't whether she would escape, but whether she would remain human in the process. Freedom, Rosa was beginning to understand, might require her to become someone else entirely. Someone who could walk among free people without arousing suspicion, who could smile and speak and move through the world as if she had never felt the weight of chains, never buried her tormentor in unmarked ground. But first, she had to survive one more night in the place where she had killed a man and gotten away with it. What Rosa didn't know was that Sheriff Whitman had found something else near Willow Creek, something that would haunt the investigation for months and eventually lead a very different kind of hunter straight to her door. A single button, carved from mother of pearl and worth more than most slaves earned in a lifetime, lay half buried in the mud near Willow Creek. Sheriff Whitman pocketed it without telling anyone, sensing it didn't belong to Barrett's torn clothing. This button would eventually unravel Rosa's carefully constructed fiction, but not in the way anyone expected. Rosa left the Barrett plantation on September 3rd, 1852, carrying nothing but stolen bread wrapped in stolen cloth and the memory of leather tightening around a dead man's throat. The pre-dawn darkness provided cover as she slipped through the slave quarters one final time, her bare feet finding the familiar paths by instinct. She paused at Sarah's cabin door, wanting to whisper goodbye to the woman who had shown her small kindnesses, but even that risk was too great. Some farewells were luxuries that escaped slaves couldn't afford. The Missouri countryside stretched before her like an ocean of possibilities and threats. Rosa had studied the night sky from Barrett's fields, memorizing the patterns that would guide her north toward freedom. But knowledge gleaned from stolen moments wasn't the same as experience, and experience was a harsh teacher for a 17-year-old girl traveling alone through hostile territory. Street Louis rose from the Mississippi riverbank like a fever dream of civilization. Brick buildings reaching toward heaven, steamboat whistles echoing off cobblestone streets, and the constant flow of humanity that Rosa hoped would swallow her without trace. The city's scents overwhelmed her senses. Coal smoke from factory chimneys, rotting vegetables from market stalls, the sharp tang of river water mixed with human waste. After years of plantation isolation, the urban chaos felt like stepping into another world entirely. Rosa's first challenge was immediate and brutal. She looked like exactly what she was. Her homespun dress, calloused hands, and the particular wariness that marked enslaved people made her instantly recognizable to anyone who cared to look closely. But Street, Louis in 1852 was a city built on contradictions. A slave state metropolis where free blacks lived and worked alongside their enslaved cousins, where abolitionists and slave catchers operated in the same neighborhoods, where a careful person might disappear into the crowd if they knew the right moves. She found shelter in Bloody Island, a district near the riverfront, where desperate people gathered like debris after a flood. Here, runaway slaves mixed with Irish immigrants, German refugees, and American drifters, all united by poverty and the shared understanding that asking too many questions was dangerous. Rosa rented a corner of a basement room for 2 cents a night, paying with coins stolen from Margaret Barrett's dresser. The transformation began immediately. Rosa studied the free black women in the markets, copying their posture, their speech patterns, the way they moved through the world with something that looked like confidence. She practiced walking without the submissive shuffle that had kept her alive on the plantation. She learned to meet white people's eyes for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to seem honest, not so long as to appear threatening. Most crucially, she learned to lie with the fluidity of someone born to freedom. Rosa became Rose Johnson, a free woman of color from New Orleans whose papers had been lost in a riverboat fire. The story was plausible enough for casual questioning. Riverboat disasters were common, records were often incomplete, and New Orleans was far enough away to discourage verification. She found work as a seamstress in a shop owned by Mrs. Elizabeth Chen, a Chinese immigrant who asked no questions about backgrounds and paid in cash. For 3 months, Rosa's reinvention seemed complete. She attended Sunday services at the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where she sang hymns with genuine feeling for the first time in her life. She saved every penny she could, planning eventual passage to Canada where slavery couldn't legally touch her. She even began to believe that William Barrett's death might remain buried forever in Missouri soil. But the Underground Railroad wasn't just a network of hiding places and secret routes. It was also a communication system, and information traveled along its channels like water finding the lowest ground. The message reached St. Louis in November. A house servant had vanished from a Missouri plantation the same night her master disappeared. Sheriff's departments across 3 states were sharing descriptions, offering rewards, and following leads. Rosa's carefully constructed identity began to feel as fragile as paper in rain. The button Sheriff Whitman had found belonged to Margaret Barrett's best dress, torn off during Rosa's final struggle with the colonel in his study. Whitman had shown it to Mrs. Barrett, who identified it immediately and remembered that Rosa had been responsible for mending that particular garment just days before her husband's disappearance. Suddenly, Barrett's wilderness accident looked less accidental. Whitman expanded his investigation, sending descriptions of Rosa to sheriff's offices, posting offices, and known Underground Railroad contacts throughout the Mississippi River Valley. The net was tightening, but slowly, bureaucratically, with the grinding inevitability of a legal system that valued property above human life. Rosa sensed the change before she understood it. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms. Mrs. Chen watched her with new wariness. Other workers at the dress shop began keeping their distance. The paranoia that had kept her alive on the plantation reasserted itself with familiar urgency. December brought the first real scare. A slave catcher named Benjamin Pike arrived in St. Louis with a pocketful of reward notices and a reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found. Pike was a professional hunter of human beings, a man who understood that escaped slaves left traces like any other quarry. He checked church records, questioned shopkeepers, haunted the neighborhoods where free blacks lived and worked. Rosa saw him before he saw her. A thin white man with predator's eyes, studying faces in the market crowd with the patience of someone who got paid for results. She ducked behind a vegetable cart and watched as Pike showed her description to vendors, offering silver coins for information. The hunt had found her trail. What Rosa didn't realize was that Pike's arrival had also triggered something else. the activation of networks she never knew existed, operated by people who had been watching her transformation with interest. But were these watchers friends preparing to help her escape, or enemies preparing to collect the bounty on her head? The knock came at 4:37 a.m. on December 19, 1852, Pine. 3 sharp raps that shattered Rosa's sleep like breaking glass. She knew immediately that her months of freedom had ended. But the face at her door wasn't Benjamin Pike's predatory sneer or Sheriff Whitman's official authority, 12M. It was someone whose betrayal would cut deeper than any stranger's pursuit. Rosa had been dreaming of the Barrett plantation, of leather cord and midnight graves. When the knocking dragged her back to the basement room, she'd called home for 3 months. The street, Lewis winter had frozen the Mississippi solid enough to walk on, and ice crystals had formed on the inside of her single window, creating a crystalline barrier between her hiding place and the world that wanted to drag her back to chains. She pressed her eye to the door's crack and saw him, Marcus Thompson, a free black man from the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where she'd sung hymns and pretended to pray for forgiveness she didn't seek. Marcus worked as a porter for the railroad company, a respectable job that allowed him to support his wife and 2 children. Rosa had admired his quiet dignity, the way he carried himself through White Street. Louis, without bending his spine or lowering his eyes. Now Marcus stood in her doorway with silver coins bulging in his coat pocket and shame written across his features like a confession. "Rose," he whispered, using the false name she'd worn like armor for months. "You need to come with me, right now." Rosa's hand found the kitchen knife she'd kept under her pillow since Pike's arrival in the city. The blade felt inadequate against the weight of inevitability, but it was all she had left of agency in a world determined to strip her of choices. Marcus saw the knife and raised his hand slowly. "I'm not here to hurt you, but Pike knows. He knows everything." The slave catcher had been methodical in his investigation, Marcus explained in hurried whispers. Pike had traced Rosa's movements from the dress shop to the church, from the church to her boarding house, from her boarding house to the market stalls, where she'd bought food with stolen coins. He'd interviewed Mrs. Chen, who had reluctantly admitted her suspicions about Rose Johnson's mysterious past. He'd questioned church members, offering rewards that seemed generous to people who earned pennies for back-breaking labor. But Pike's real breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Margaret Barrett herself had traveled to Street, Lewis bringing with her a detailed description of Rosa's distinctive scar, a crescent-shaped mark on her left shoulder from a childhood burn. It was the kind of identifying feature that no amount of careful performance could hide, the biological signature that connected Rose Johnson to the enslaved girl who had vanished the night William Barrett died. Marcus had overheard Pike's plans at the railroad depot, where bounty hunters often gathered to share information and coordinate captures. Tonight, Pike would raid the boarding house with local authorities, expecting to find Rosa asleep and defenseless. The reward for her return was substantial, $300, enough to feed Marcus's family for 2 years. "But I can't do it," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "I can't be the one who sends you back to hell for money." Rosa studied his face, searching for deception. In her experience, people who claimed moral authority were often the most dangerous, their righteousness providing convenient cover for selfishness. But Marcus's anguish seemed genuine, his conflict visible in the tremor of his hands and the tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. "Then why are you here?" Rosa asked, the knife steady in her grip. "Because there's another way." Marcus had connections Rosa didn't know about, not the formal underground railroad network, but something more improvised and dangerous. A German immigrant named Klaus Weber ran a brewery near the river, a business that provided legitimate cover for moving people and goods without official scrutiny. Weber had helped other runaways reach Canada, motivated by his own memories of fleeing political persecution in Bavaria. But Weber's help came with conditions that made Rosa's stomach clench with familiar dread. "He wants to meet with you first," Marcus said. "Tonight, Before Pike makes his move, Weber needs to be sure you're worth the risk. The mathematics of survival had always been brutal for enslaved people, but Rosa was discovering that freedom carried its own terrible calculations. Every potential ally had prices. Every offer of help came with strings that might strangle her more surely than Barrett's shoelaces. How could she trust Weber when Marcus himself had been tempted by Pike's silver? How could she trust anyone in a world that had taught her that human beings were commodities to be bought, sold, and betrayed? Time pressed against her like a physical weight. Pike's raid would come before dawn, and Rosa's window for escape was closing with each passing minute. She could run alone into the December wilderness, but winter would likely accomplish what slave catchers couldn't. She could try to disappear deeper into street, Lewis's underworld, but Pike had already proven his ability to track her through the city's maze of streets and secrets. Or she could trust Marcus Thompson, a man who had just confessed to considering her betrayal, and place her life in the hands of a German brewer she'd never met. If Weber decides I'm not worth the risk, Rosa asked, Marcus couldn't meet her eyes. Then Pike gets what he came for. The choice felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, with wolves behind her and darkness below. But Rosa had survived 17 years by understanding that sometimes the most dangerous option was also the only one that led to survival. She folded the knife back into her coat and followed Marcus Thompson into the frozen street Lewis night, not knowing whether she was walking toward freedom or into the most elaborate trap anyone had ever set for her. What Weber wanted from Rosa would test more than her courage, would force her to confront the question of how much of her humanity she was willing to sacrifice to remain free. Klaus Weber's brewery smelled of hops, yeast, and something else that made Rosa's skin crawl, the metallic scent of fear mixed with desperation. The German immigrant studied her across his cluttered office like a merchant appraising livestock. Weber's proposition would save Rosa's life, but the price he demanded would haunt her dreams for decades to come. The Weber Brewery occupied 3 buildings near the St. Louis riverfront, its brick chimneys belching steam into the December night. Klaus Weber had built his business from nothing after fleeing Bavaria in 1848, when political upheavals sent thousands of German refugees streaming into American cities. Unlike many immigrants who arrived with empty pockets and broken dreams, Weber had possessed something valuable: knowledge of how to move people and goods without attracting official attention. Rosa followed Marcus through a maze of copper brewing tanks and wooden fermentation barrels, the building's interior lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Workers moved through the facility even at this late hour, their faces carefully averted as Marcus led Rosa toward Weber's private office. The brewery operated around the clock, providing perfect cover for activities that required darkness and discretion. Weber himself was a compact man with intelligent eyes and hands stained permanently brown from handling hops. He spoke English with a thick accent that forced listeners to lean closer, a linguistic camouflage that allowed him to seem less threatening than he actually was. His office walls were covered with maps of river routes, railroad schedules, and what looked like coded correspondence with contacts throughout the Mississippi Valley. "So," Weber said, gesturing for Rosa to sit in a chair that faced his desk, "you are the woman who killed her master with his own shoelaces." Rosa's blood froze. She had told no one about the specific method of Barrett's death, had buried that detail along with his body in the forgotten acre. But Weber spoke with the confidence of someone who possessed information that should have been impossible to obtain. "Pike has been thorough in his investigation," Weber explained, reading the shock on Rosa's face. He spoke with the sheriff, with Barrett's widow, with servants who noticed details they thought unimportant at the time. A study window left open, a broken decanter, mud tracked through the house. The picture these details paint is quite clear to someone who knows how to look. Weber opened a leather portfolio and spread papers across his desk: reward notices, sheriff's reports, correspondence between law enforcement agencies across 3 states. Rosa's face stared back at her from crude drawings. Her description circulated like a wanted poster for a common criminal. Pike will raid your boarding house in less than 2 hours, Weber continued. He has local authorities with him, legal papers authorizing your arrest. If you are captured, you will be returned to Missouri to face charges for Barrett's murder. The penalty for slaves who kill their masters is death by hanging, usually preceded by torture designed to serve as an example to others. Rosa had known this, of course, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly made her stomach clench with familiar terror. She forced her voice to remain steady. Marcus said you could help me reach Canada. I can, Weber said. But help comes with prices, and some prices are higher than others. Weber's network could indeed smuggle Rosa to freedom, but not immediately. Pike's investigation had made the usual routes too dangerous, forcing Weber to devise a more elaborate deception. Rosa would need to disappear completely, not just from Street Louis, but from her own identity. The woman who had been born into slavery and briefly tasted freedom as Rose Johnson would have to die, replaced by someone else entirely. The process would take months. Rosa would live in the brewery's hidden basement, a space Weber had designed for exactly this purpose. She would help with his operations, not just the legal brewing business, but the other activities that funded his humanitarian work. Weber smuggled more than people. He also moved stolen goods, forged documents, and information that various parties preferred to keep secret. You would become my employee, Weber explained. Not my slave, but not truly free either. You would be bound to me by necessity until I judge it safe to move you north. Rosa understood that Weber was offering her survival wrapped in a different kind of bondage. She would trade Barrett's violence for Weber's control, plantation chains for brewery obligations. But she would be alive, and alive meant the possibility of true freedom eventually. What exactly would you require of me? Rosa asked. Weber's smile was cold as December river ice. There are people who need to disappear permanently, just as you have disappeared. Sometimes they are runaway slaves. Sometimes they are political refugees. Sometimes they are criminals fleeing justice. My network provides this service for appropriate compensation. Rosa began to understand the terrible mathematics of Weber's operation. He saved some people by sacrificing others, funded rescues through activities that created new victims. The basement where Rosa would hide had housed other desperate souls, some of whom had earned their freedom through services that left bloodstains on their consciences. You killed your master to protect yourself, Weber said. That demonstrates both capability and motivation. I have need of someone with your particular skills and willingness to cross moral boundaries for survival. The room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of brewing operations and the Mississippi River flowing past the building's foundation. Rosa realized that Weber wasn't just offering her sanctuary. He was recruiting her for work that would require the same desperate violence she had used against Barrett. She thought of Marcus Thompson, who had wrestled with his conscience before warning her about Pike's raid. She thought of the church congregation who had welcomed Rose Johnson without questioning her past. She thought of Mrs. Chen, who had given her honest work despite obvious suspicions about her background. Some people had shown her kindness, expecting nothing in return. Others had calculated the profit in her suffering. Weber represented a third category, someone who would preserve her life while demanding pieces of her soul as payment. Rosa had perhaps 30 minutes to decide before Pike's raid made the choice for her. She could reject Weber's bargain and face certain capture, or accept his terms and survive by becoming the kind of person she had killed Barrett to avoid becoming. But what Weber hadn't told her was that his basement already held another refugee, whose presence would complicate his plans in ways none of them could anticipate. The basement beneath Weber's brewery held 2 cots, but Rosa hadn't expected the second one to be occupied by a 12-year-old white girl whose presence would shatter every assumption about who deserved freedom and who decided the price. This girl's story would force Rosa to confront the hardest question of all. When survival requires violence, Who gets to choose who lives and who dies? Weber led Rosa down wooden steps that creaked under their weight. The basement air, thick with moisture, and the earthy smell of root cellars. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows on stone walls, and Rosa could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness, the Mississippi seeping through foundation cracks, a reminder that even underground refuges weren't truly safe from the world above. The basement was larger than Rosa had expected, divided into several rooms by hanging canvas sheets. Weber had designed the space carefully. Ventilation shafts disguised as brewing equipment, exhausts, multiple exit routes, and storage areas for supplies that could sustain hidden refugees for months if necessary. But Rosa's attention fixed immediately on the girl sitting on one of the cots, a pale child with tangled brown hair and eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. She wore a dress that had once been fine but now hung in tatters, and her hands showed the kind of damage that came from hard labor. "This is Emma Carlyle," Weber said matter-of-factly. "She arrived 3 weeks ago under circumstances similar to your own." Emma looked up at Rosa with the careful assessment of someone who had learned that survival meant reading people quickly and accurately. "You killed someone too," she said. Not a question, but a statement delivered with the flat certainty of shared experience. Weber explained Emma's story with the clinical detachment he brought to all his business arrangements. She was the daughter of Judge Harrison Carlyle, a prominent street Louis businessman who served on multiple boards and donated generously to local charities. But Judge Carlyle's public reputation concealed private habits that had driven his daughter to desperate measures. Emma had endured her father's violations for years, trapped by the same legal and social structures that had imprisoned Rosa on the Barrett plantation. Children, like slaves, were considered property in 1852 America. They had no legal recourse against abuse, no official advocates, no escape routes that didn't require them to become criminals in the eyes of the law. The judge's death had been less dramatic than Barrett's strangulation. Emma had simply added rat poison to his evening whiskey, then watched him die slowly over several hours. She had staged the scene to look like a heart attack, a deception that might have succeeded if not for the judge's business partner discovering financial irregularities that prompted a more thorough investigation. Emma's flight to Weber's brewery had followed the same desperate logic as Rosa's journey. A child with blood on her hands, seeking sanctuary from a world that would execute her for defending herself against someone who should have protected her. "You see the complication," Weber said to Rosa. "Two fugitives with similar backgrounds but very different values in the market for human life." Rosa understood immediately. Emma Carlyle was white, the daughter of a wealthy man, someone whose disappearance would generate newspaper headlines and sustained investigation. Pike and other bounty hunters would pursue her with resources and determination that no escaped slave could command. But Emma also represented a different kind of opportunity. Her father's wealth, properly accessed, could fund Weber's operations for years. The judge left a substantial estate, Weber continued. Emma knows the locations of hidden accounts, safe combinations, investment portfolios, information that could be quite valuable to someone with the right connections. Rosa studied Emma's face, recognizing the calculating intelligence behind her childish features. This girl had survived by learning to weaponize the adults around her, just as Rosa had survived by learning to become invisible. They were products of the same system of violence, separated only by the accident of skin color that determined which kind of property they had been considered. But their situations created conflicting pressures on Weber's operation. Emma's pursuit would be more intensive, but her potential value was enormous. Rosa's capture was inevitable if she remained in street. Lewis, but her worth to Weber lay primarily in her willingness to do violence on his behalf. Weber's next words confirmed Rosa's growing understanding of the trap she had walked into. "I can move one person north safely within the next month," he said. "The routes Pike's investigation hasn't compromised. The contacts who aren't under surveillance. but only one. The other will need to wait, continue working for me until the situation changes." The silence that followed felt heavy as river mud. Rosa realized that Weber hadn't just recruited her for his network. He had created a competition between two desperate people, each forced to justify their right to freedom at the other's expense. Emma spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I can pay you more than she can. My father's accounts contain thousands of dollars." Rosa felt the familiar rage building in her chest, the same fury that had driven her to wrap leather cord around Barrett's throat. Here was the essential cruelty of their world, that even in sanctuary, even among people who claimed to oppose slavery and abuse, the mathematics of value still reduced human beings to their economic worth. But Rosa also recognized something else in Emma's desperation. The girl was terrified that her whiteness wouldn't be enough to save her, that in Weber's basement, the usual hierarchies might not apply. What neither of them realized was that Weber's basement contained more than 2 cots and hidden supplies. It also held the evidence of previous choices, previous refugees who had competed for the same limited salvation Rosa and Emma now sought. And some of those previous refugees had left behind more than just bloodstains on the stone floor. Rosa discovered the bones on her 3rd night in Weber's basement, hidden beneath loose floorboards that shifted under her restless pacing. The skull was small, delicate, belonging to someone who had once competed for the same escape route Rosa and Emma now coveted. Weber's sanctuary wasn't just a way station to freedom. It was a killing ground where desperation met calculation, and only the most valuable refugees survived to see Canada. The revelation came by accident. Rosa had been unable to sleep, her mind churning with the impossible choice Weber had forced between her and Emma Carlyle. She paced the basement's perimeter, testing walls and examining corners with the thoroughness of someone who understood that survival often depended on knowing every exit and weakness in her environment. A loose stone near the eastern wall caught her attention. When she pressed against it, an entire section of flooring shifted, revealing a cavity beneath. Rosa's hands found the bones before her eyes could process what she was touching. Ribs, vertebrae, and finally, the unmistakable curve of a human skull. But these weren't the only remains hidden beneath Weber's basement floor. As Rosa's fingers explored the cavity, she found more bones, fragments of clothing, personal effects that told stories of people who had sought Weber's help and found something else entirely. A child's wooden toy, carved in the style Rosa had seen among German immigrants. A brass button from a Union Army uniform. A woman's hair ribbon, still tied in a careful bow. Each item represented someone who had descended into this basement seeking passage to freedom, only to become part of Weber's hidden foundation. Rosa understood with crystalline clarity that Weber's operation wasn't just funded by criminal activities. It was sustained by the systematic murder of refugees whose value couldn't match their risk. The brewer had perfected a grotesque form of triage, saving those who could pay or serve his purposes while eliminating those who represented only liability. Emma stirred on her cot as Rosa carefully replaced the loose floorboards. "What are you doing?" the girl asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Rosa met Emma's eyes in the lamplight, recognizing a fellow survivor's paranoia. "Learning the rules of the game. Weber is making us play." She told Emma about the bones, about the hidden graveyard beneath their feet, about the calculation that reduced human lives to profit margins and risk assessments. Emma listened with the same analytical attention she had learned to apply to her father's moods, understanding immediately that their competition for escape had been designed to have only one survivor. "He's going to kill one of us," Emma said matter-of-factly, "after he's extracted whatever value he can from both." The realization created an unexpected alliance between the enslaved girl and the judge's daughter. Their backgrounds, their skin color, their social positions had made them enemies in Weber's framework, but their shared recognition of his true nature transformed them into conspirators. They began planning that night, whispering in the darkness, while Weber's brewery operations continued overhead. Emma possessed knowledge of her father's business networks, financial connections that extended throughout the Mississippi Valley. Rosa had survived 17 years of plantation life by learning to read people's intentions, to move unseen, to strike precisely when violence became necessary. Together they mapped Weber's routines, identified the basement's weaknesses, and prepared for the confrontation they knew was coming. Because Weber would eventually demand that one of them eliminate the other, not just to solve his logistics problem, but to test their willingness to do anything for survival. The test came on December 23, 1852, when Weber descended into the basement, carrying a revolver and wearing the cold expression Rosa had learned to associate with death. Pike's investigation has intensified, Weber announced, his accent thicker under stress. He knows both of you are in Street Lewis, and he has expanded his search to include possible safe houses. I can no longer risk keeping both of you here. Weber set the revolver on the small table between their cots, its metal surface gleaming in the lamplight. One of you will accompany me to Canada next week. The other will remain here permanently. Rosa stared at the weapon, understanding that Weber expected them to fight for survival like animals, to reduce themselves to the level of violence that would justify his view of human nature. This was how he had eliminated previous refugees, DV, by forcing them to destroy each other, by making them complicit in their own brutalization. But Rosa had learned something from her months of freedom, from the kindness of people like Sarah, the cook, and Marcus Thompson. She had discovered that survival didn't always require becoming a monster, that sometimes the most powerful choice was refusing to play by rules designed to destroy your humanity. No, Rosa said simply. Weber's eyebrows rose. I beg your pardon? I said no. I won't kill her for your entertainment, and I won't let her kill me for yours. Emma nodded slowly, understanding Rosa's strategy. We know about the bones under the floor. We know what you really do to people who seek your help. Weber's hand moved toward the revolver, but Rosa was already moving, her body remembering the desperate precision that had ended William Barrett's life. She struck Weber's wrist with the heel of her palm, sending the gun clattering across the stone floor, then followed with her elbow to his throat. Weber collapsed, gasping, as Emma retrieved the revolver. For a moment, the basement was silent, except for the sound of 3 people breathing hard and the distant rumble of brewery operations that would soon discover their boss's absence. Rosa looked at the weapon in Emma's hands, remembering another night when violence had seemed like the only path to freedom. But this time, she had a choice about what came next. What she decided would determine not just whether she and Emma survived Weber's trap, but whether they could escape Street Lewis without becoming the kind of people who left bones beneath basement floors. Rosa's capture came not from Weber's betrayal or Pike's investigation, but from Emma Carlisle's desperate miscalculation, a decision that would transform a runaway slave story into a symbol of resistance that newspapers from New York to New Orleans couldn't ignore. The trial that followed would force 12 white men to decide whether murder committed in self-defense could ever be justified when the victim was enslaved and the perpetrator owned her body. Weber recovered consciousness 20 minutes after Rosa's attack, his throat bruised but his survival instincts intact. Rather than summoning his workers or attempting immediate revenge, the German brewer made a calculation that revealed the pragmatic core beneath his humanitarian facade. Rosa and Emma represented problems that law enforcement could solve more efficiently than violence. Weber's call to the Street Lewis police came at dawn on December 24, 1852. He reported a break-in at his brewery, describing 2 dangerous fugitives who had threatened his life and stolen money from his office safe. The story was plausible enough for authorities who knew Weber as a respectable businessman, and it provided perfect cover for his actual criminal operations. But Emma Carlisle's panic undid their careful planning. As police surrounded the brewery, she made a desperate bargain that would haunt Rosa for the rest of her life. Emma offered to testify against Rosa in exchange for her own protection, claiming that the enslaved girl had forced her to participate in Weber's assault through threats and violence. The mathematics were brutally simple. A white girl's testimony against a black woman would carry absolute weight in Missouri courts, regardless of the truth. Emma's decision to save herself by sacrificing Rosa represented the same systemic logic that had made slavery possible, the reduction of human worth to skin color and social position. Rosa's arrest made headlines across the Mississippi Valley, but not for the reasons anyone expected. The story that emerged in newspaper accounts wasn't simply about a runaway slave captured after months of freedom. It became something larger, more dangerous to the institutions that depended on keeping enslaved people silent and invisible. The Missouri Republican ran the first detailed account on January 2, 1853. Slave girl's desperate flight ends in capture. But the reporter, a young man named Thomas Hartley, had interviewed Rosa extensively and found himself confronted with a story that challenged every assumption about slavery, resistance, and the nature of justice in America. Rosa had refused legal counsel initially, understanding that no lawyer in Missouri would mount a genuine defense for an enslaved woman who had killed her master. But Hartley's articles attracted attention from unexpected quarters: abolitionists in New England, free black communities in Philadelphia and Boston, even some white Southerners who recognized that Rosa's case exposed uncomfortable truths about the system they defended. Attorney Samuel Morrison arrived in St. Louis in February, sent by the American Anti-Slavery Society, with instructions to use Rosa's trial as a platform for challenging the legal foundations of human bondage. Morrison was a skilled lawyer who understood that Rosa's case offered something previous slavery-related trials had lacked: a defendant whose actions could be framed as justified self-defense rather than simple property destruction. The prosecution's case seemed ironclad. Rosa had killed William Barrett, fled the plantation, lived under false identity for months, and assaulted Weber during her capture. Missouri law provided no ambiguity about the penalty for slaves who murdered their masters: death by hanging, usually preceded by public humiliation, designed to deter other potential rebels. But Morrison's defense strategy transformed the courtroom into something unprecedented, a space where the reality of slavery could be examined openly, where the daily violence that sustained the institution could be documented and challenged. Morrison called witnesses who had never before been allowed to testify in American courts. Sarah the cook described Barrett's systematic abuse of Rosa since childhood. Marcus Thompson testified about the Underground Railroad networks that had sheltered her flight. Even Weber, under cross-examination, revealed details about the trade in human misery that funded his operations. Most dramatically, Morrison convinced the court to allow Rosa to testify on her own behalf, a legal precedent that shocked observers throughout the South. For the first time in Missouri legal history, an enslaved person was permitted to describe their own experiences, to explain their actions in their own words. Rosa's testimony lasted 3 hours. She described her childhood on the Barrett plantation, the progressive escalation of her master's abuse, the night she fought back with his own shoelaces. She spoke about her months of freedom in St. Louis, about discovering what it meant to earn wages and choose her own associates and attend church without permission. But Rosa's most powerful moment came when prosecutor James Whitfield attempted to characterize her as naturally violent and prone to criminality. Rosa looked directly at the jury, 12 white men who owned slaves themselves, and asked the question that newspapers would quote for decades: if your daughter was being violated by a man who claimed to own her body, would you call her defense of herself a crime, or would you call it courage? The courtroom fell silent. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at their hands. Because Rosa had forced them to confront the logical contradiction at slavery's heart, the simultaneous claim that enslaved people were both property without rights and moral agents responsible for their actions. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. guilty of murder in the first degree, with a recommendation for life imprisonment rather than execution. The compromise verdict reflected the impossible position Rosa had created for them. They couldn't acquit her without undermining the legal basis for slavery itself, but executing her would validate her claim that enslaved people had the right to defend themselves against abuse. Rosa received her sentence standing straight, her eyes fixed on the judge, her voice steady as she spoke her final words to the court. "I am not sorry for what I did to William Barrett. I am only sorry that it took me 17 years to find the courage to do it." The trial's impact extended far beyond Missouri's borders. Northern newspapers ran lengthy excerpts from the proceedings. Abolitionist societies distributed transcripts as propaganda tools. Even some Southern publications acknowledged that Rosa's case had exposed aspects of slavery that were difficult to defend publicly. But perhaps the most significant consequence was invisible. The conversations that began in slave quarters throughout the South, where Rosa's story spread through the same networks that had sheltered her flight. Her name became a whispered symbol of resistance, proof that enslaved people could fight back and survive long enough to tell their stories. Rosa disappeared into the Missouri State Penitentiary in March 1853, but her influence on American history was just beginning. Because sometimes the most powerful victories look like defeats, and sometimes courage means accepting consequences that lesser people would consider unbearable. Even today, historians debate whether Rosa survived her imprisonment or died in the penitentiary's brutal conditions. But they all agree on one fact: her trial changed the national conversation about slavery in ways that contributed directly to the crisis that would tear America apart a decade later. Local legend claims that on quiet nights near the site of the old Barrett plantation, you can still hear the sound of leather cord tightening around a throat, not as a ghost story, but as a reminder that some forms of justice operate outside the boundaries of law. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.